Hi everyone, it's Tom here, jumping on before we start this episode proper, which looks at Pope Francis, his life, legacy and the impact he's had on the Church and the wider world. Since we recorded this episode on the 1st of May, a new Pope has been elected, Cardinal Robert Francis Provost. He's the first American to hold the position and is widely seen as a moderate and pastoral figure, known for his thoughtful, bridge-building approach. Taking the name Pope Leo XIV, his election marks the start of a new chapter for the Catholic Church. With that in mind, we hope this conversation about Pope Francis offers helpful context on where the Church has been and where it might be headed.
Hello and welcome to the Political Dispatch, the podcast that explores big issues and ideas in a conversational way.
My name is Lily Mott.
I'm Sid Kurapati.
And I'm Tom Spare.
So in today's episode, we are focusing on the life and legacy of Pope Francis, the first Pope from the Americas, the first Jesuit Pope, the first Pope from outside Europe in over 1200 years, who passed away on Easter Monday, aged 88.
Pope Francis, born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Argentina, served as the Bishop of Rome and leader of the Roman Catholic Church between the 13th of March, 2013, and the 21st of April. On the day that we're recording this episode, the 1st of May, the conclave has not happened yet.
So we're speaking from the past. So all of the people listening now, you're in the future and have a better idea of what's actually going on.
Spooky.
Yeah, exactly. But we thought it's important to mark the passing of Pope Francis because even if you're not one of the 1.4 billion Catholics in the world, the papacy, the Vatican, the Holy See, the Pope, these institutions, this person means something, right? So they have power, they operate in the political world. And when the Pope speaks, the world listens. And when a Pope dies, it is a world event. The media descends on Rome and it serves as a moment of reflection. Although I suppose I'm sort of carrying on in the narrative that I saw on the BBC, like the world mourns the passing of Pope Francis. A lot of people in the world were sad that he passed away. But I suppose we also have to think that we don't live in a Christian-centric world as well. So it's worth reflecting on that too, that there is a diversity of different religions and opinions and people that don't practice or don't have a faith, people that are spiritual. And I think it's something actually in the conversation that we're going to talk about today. Pope Francis was a Jesuit and believed in being close to God, being close to the people which he served, but also was really important with like bringing people together and different faiths and so on. So that's also worth pointing out that we're not doing this episode because a particular religious view. It's more of the symbolism, the role that the Pope plays in the world.
Absolutely, Tom. And just to add on to that, I think there's a lot of political significance to the office of the papacy. The ideology of the next Pope really determines what the ideology of the Church is going to be to a large extent. So, therefore, keeping that in mind, the format of today's episode is going to be a little different from the usual. Tom has conducted an interview with Fr Damian Howard, the Senior Catholic Chaplain at Oxford University. Tom, can you tell us a little bit about Father Howard?
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Sid. So Father Damian Howard grew up in Surrey, in the southeast of England. He's lived in London, in Brussels, in Paris, Cuba and Chile, and he is a Jesuit himself, so much like Pope Francis, and was formerly the provincial of the Jesuits in Britain, so the most senior Jesuit in Britain for 6 years. He also used to lecture at the University of London, teaching about Christian-Muslim relations. I really enjoyed this conversation. It's a difficult time for the Catholic faith, and he's very busy in the work that he does. He just come from May Day celebrations out in the city of Oxford. So I really appreciate the conversation. I'm grateful for him and for him agreeing to do the interview.
And did you ask Father Howard if he's watched Conclave, Tom?
I did, and he has some interesting thoughts on the film itself.
Right. Well, here is Tom's interview with Father Damian Howard about the life and legacy of Pope Francis and the Conclave.
The film version and the actual one, just to clarify.
Enjoy, guys.
So my name is Fr Damian Howard. Currently, I'm the Senior Catholic Chaplain at Oxford University, a post I've held for a year and a half. And I've been a Jesuit for the last 35 years. And during that time, I've done a variety of things. I've worked in parishes, taught in schools. I've been a university lecturer. I've got a doctorate in Christian-Muslim relations. And my last job before this was leading the Jesuit order in this country for 6 years.
So before we discuss the life and legacy of His Holiness Pope Francis and the influence of the Jesuit teaching on his papacy and the role of the Conclave as well, I'd like to begin with you. You've hinted about your life up until this moment. Could you share some key moments or interactions or influences that led to where you are today?
Yes, without going too far back into detail that I can't remember. I first heard about Jesuit priests when I was about 7 years old. Well, I didn't make up my mind then that I wanted to be one. It was certainly quite an attractive thing that I remember hearing from my mother. She'd been helped by a number of Jesuit priests in the centre of London when she was a student. And I thought, gosh, I'd like to be a helpful person who understands the Catholic faith in some depth and is able to, as I say, to help people. And that's, as I learned, a very Jesuit instinct to help people to find God and to understand their lives in that relationship. So that's always been a kind of orientation for me, I suppose. I left school, went to university. I wasn't a very practicing Catholic as a child. Went through a little bit of a sort of atheistic, nihilistic phase, as teenagers often do. Thought that was very cool. But then by the time I got to university, I started off as a music student, and I found my way back to Christianity, and specifically to the Catholicism of my family by studying theology. It's rather odd, I know, to do theology first and then get into faith, but often it goes the other way around. People lose their faith when they study theology sometimes. But for me, that was a very important experience, and also the experience of studying other religions. Something about coming at the mystery of God and of reality through the eyes of, for me, it was Hindus and Buddhists, and more recently in my life through Islam. That helps you understand much more deeply who you really are as a Christian. So I've always found that really helpful. Since then, I suppose I've just described my life as going deeper and deeper into what feels like a very deep friendship with Jesus Christ. And what's been helpful to me in that is the foundation of Jesuit spirituality, which you may have heard of, the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. Not so much a way of praying as a process of personal development and growth through various stages leading to a certain kind of way of being in the world. As St. Ignatius would put it, being able to find God very easily. So it's a very experiential kind of way of being a Catholic. A little bit different from those forms of Catholicism, which are how can I say, more objective, more about a certain kind of sense of how you should be human. It's about a way of growing into that and experiencing God. So it's kind of in the mystical tradition, if you like, of Christian theology, and that's always been something I've rather liked. I guess that's the musician in me. I like to experience the music and to sense God playing the music, and even to be invited to join in the orchestra is, for me, a very powerful way of thinking about it.
Pope Francis represented many firsts. So he was the first pope from the Americas, first non-European pope for many years, and the first to be named Francis. Could you talk a little bit about his early life and the signs in that in the early part that perhaps suggested he was destined for something greater to the papacy and to other positions in the church?
I'm not really sure there were many signs. I mean, I've read some good books about him. When he tells the story of his childhood or his young adulthood, it's a story of a very ordinary kind of life, but with one or two, I won't say extraordinary experiences, but experiences which for him were infused with a sense of the presence of God. And I don't think that's necessarily a sign of that he was destined to be a great leader in the church, let alone destined to be Pope. So he talks very movingly about the experience of finding himself in church one evening. I think it's got something to do with going out on a date, if I remember correctly. And he just feels moved to go to confession. And there is the priest, as if waiting for him personally. Well, whether the priest had that sense or not is another matter. But that sense that God wanted to reach into his life and touch his heart at that moment in his life, and that made all the difference, was something that marked him. And I can relate to that sense that there are moments in our lives which you look at and you think, well, there's nothing particularly important about that. And yet somehow the fingerprints of God are all over it. And it's not so much that that's a clear sign that he's destined for some sort of great leadership role, but that's the kind of experience he would trace the story back to. So it's in a way the inverse of what you're talking about. The later role of leadership makes sense because of early experiences, which in and of themselves very mundane. And yet somehow he sensed a call, an invitation, which he gave himself to generously and which turned out to be stunningly fruitful.
And linked to that, what qualities did Pope Francis bring to the papacy that set him apart perhaps from his predecessors?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question too. I when you say his predecessors, I take it you mean his immediate predecessors, 3 or 4 popes prior to him. I mean, each pope is unique. These days, people often lump Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI together as though they were terribly similar. What they really weren't. Their theology was extremely different. True, they worked together. They were keen co-collaborators during the pontificate of Pope St. John Paul II. And obviously there was a close friendship and a great deal of trust between them. But they were very, very different kinds of men, different popes. And please don't let's dwell too much on kind of an individual heroic picture of what it is to be human, because I think fundamentally important is also the context from which people come. So you think of Pope John Paul II coming from the Warsaw Pact countries, behind the Iron Curtain, as we used to think of it, coming out of that experience of atheism, pretty grim society, one set up in opposition to the capitalist liberal West. So his contribution wasn't just his great dramatic skills, his great skills as a communicator, his personal charisma, all those were all extremely important to his ministry. But it was also the fact that he came from Poland. And that says an enormous about his what he brought to the church. And of course also it was a key determining factor in what took place in the 1980s as the Cold War came to a rather dramatic and unexpected end. But Benedict came out of Nazi Germany. So that's not a neutral background either. A very significant one for understanding Europe, for understanding those key sensibilities which governed the West in the 20th century and which are falling apart around our ears at the moment, aren't they? Sense of the post-Second World War consensus, commitment to human rights, that extraordinary reconciliation between the church and the Jewish people, with anti-Semitism becoming rife once again, even in parts of the Catholic Church, you start to sense that Pope Benedict XVI, although he was Pope during the 21st century, in some ways his profile was incredibly steeped and meaningful in the 20th century. So what did Pope Francis bring? Well, he was Argentinian, which obviously Latin American, so a home of a huge number of Catholics in the latter part of the 20th and now the 21st century. So a really important part of the church, which up until very recently hasn't had much of a say in the running of the church that has led, was very split in the 1980s. You'll have heard about liberation theology and a church which on the one hand was strongly identified with the colonial project of Spain, to a lesser extent Portugal, and therefore was associated with the governing elite, and then in a society in which wealth disparities became exaggerated with a very, very wealthy elite. And on the other hand, a church that wanted to be very close to the poor and to indigenous people in situations of unbelievable poverty and even sometimes persecution, state-sponsored persecution, sometimes persecution sponsored by the United States, certain countries. So an extremely important traumatic part of the church. And Jorge Mario Bergoglio had been situated in that drama in a very unusual and interesting way. In that, first of all, he was in Argentina, which is always exceptional. It's not a typical Latin American country. You know, the definition that a lot of Latin Americans use for an Argentinian is an Italian who speaks Spanish and thinks he's English. In other words, he thinks he's superior to everybody else. So the Argentinians get a bit of a ribbing from other Latin Americans because they are special. Very easy to forget that at the turn of the 20th century, Argentina was one of the most wealthy and prosperous countries in the world. We're used to it being in serious economic difficulty, but that's much more recent. It wasn't that long ago that Argentina was one of the key economic player in the Western countries, if you like. So there was that exceptionality. I don't know enough about Argentinian politics to know exactly how it all plays out. But again, it's not quite the same as politics in the rest of the Latin world. The figure of Perón, figures very, very large. Sometimes people draw parallels between Bergoglio and Peron as kind of similar charismatic people with a rather exceptional and unusual take on politics and economics. Above my pay grade, I'm afraid, but I think there's something to look at there. And then the whole question, well, was Bergoglio conservative or was he a liberation theologian? Well, there's a really interesting and very complex question. And I'm afraid one of the more nauseatingly tedious aspects of what the press are saying about Pope Francis these days is that he was liberal or progressive or something one-dimensional and simplistic like that. He really was not that. He was a man on a journey, let's put it like that. He was a man that's seeking the will of God in an extraordinarily complex situation. He was a provincial, that's to say the head of the order in Argentina, during the military dictatorship, a time which caused all sorts of problems for him. And we don't know exactly what happened between him and the state and him and his fellow Jesuits during that time, but we do know that it was a difficult and challenging time. But he was also very formative, and I think he found himself pushed to his limits. He was a young provincial, I think in his 30s, early 40s. I did that job in my 50s and found it quite demanding in the comfort of central London in the first part of the 21st century. God knows what it would be like to be doing it in a country that feels as though it's falling apart, where the priests in your province are being arrested and tortured, and you are part of a complex power structure and you're being manipulated, and oh my goodness, I don't know how you deal with that. Anyway, he had to deal with that. He would say, I think he made mistakes. He was overly authoritarian, he says, and certainly not everybody under his authority was a fan. So, but they come back to the question, where did he situate himself in regard to that complex ecclesial picture? And the answer is, it's not straightforward. There was in him a deep closeness to the people. And you hear stories about the way in which the young Jesuits who he formed were sent out. They'd be sent out in the morning to go and find people in the local barrio in difficulty, and not just to be with them and to have a cup of mate with them and sympathize with them, but actually to go and solve something of their problem, get them their housing, get their kids into a school, get them the food that they need. He was an extremely hands-on Jesuit, even in those days, very close to the poor. I think he would have been impatient with those, let's say, armchair liberation theologians who were very keen to perfect it's one of the sins of the left, isn't it? That they want the perfect theory, but, when it actually comes to implementing it and dealing with power, not quite so bothered. I mean, this is something that we know a little bit from the socialist tradition in our country. So he'd be very critical of those figures in the church who wanted the latest right on liberation theology, but actually weren't terribly practical in really helping the poor, being close to the poor. But was he a friend of the governing elites who couldn't care less about social injustice? I don't think so. Quite hard to situate himself in the rather too easy categories even then. But then what happens is he goes through this painful period, I imagine quite traumatic, comes out the other end and suddenly finds that he's no longer the most popular Jesuit in the province, for reasons you can imagine. If you've governed, if you know the people very well, if you've made decisions that some people don't like, very easy to feel rejected and no longer welcome. And I think he experienced that. He was sent to a city in Argentina called Cordoba, where for a few years he processed what must have been a lot of pain, a lot of cognitive dissonance. And I think in that experience, he certainly talks about it as a profoundly transformative experience of God's grace, of discovering the healing power of God's grace, discovering a new freedom, a new simplicity of life. And out of that, he suddenly finds himself being asked to be a bishop by Pope St. John Paul II. Takes him away from a rather uncomfortable situation. I suspect everybody feels a little bit better because of that. And it launches him on a new phase of life as the leader of the church in Argentina. I think what's extraordinary from then on is a really extraordinary profile, a very unusual profile for a bishop in Latin America. Neither the sort of militant liberation theologian leftist, nor the alliance with the rich elite, but extraordinary closeness to the people, a desire for great simplicity in his life. And this is when you start to get these narratives of, look, he travels very simply. He doesn't have any money. He doesn't have a fleet of nuns to darn his socks and cook for him, which is what prelates usually have in that part of the world. Cooks for himself. And he's visiting those poorer parts of the city and is known there and loved there, and a great communicator and a very free man. So that's what's going on in his life, I think. Francis, the Pope, grows out of that. That's a kind of logical extension, but also something new even comes then, I think.
The way in which we receive information and news on our phones and through tech and everything, it's quite easy to oversimplify who a person is and to create a caricature, and for people to conveniently pick and project who they want that person to be, and we we think about other people like Nelson Mandela or other, big names, and even previous popes as well, or John Paul II.
It's a particular issue of the Catholic Church because it's a big church, whatever it is, 1 billion. Everybody assumes that the Pope is speaking right into their context. And of course, in the English-speaking world, that usually means the United States. We're just a little footnote, aren't we, on our island over here? And so that means he's either a Republican or a Democrat. And so everything has to be interpreted through that lens. And so, oh my goodness, he's nice to gay people, therefore he must be a Democrat, although even that's a bit more complicated these days. He's in favor of environmental measures, so he's leftist. I mean, it's just hopeless. It's hopeless. None of that fits. It's not him. But on the other hand, it's also inevitable that we do this. That's the good thing about your podcast, it seems to me, is you're trying deliberately to overcome some of the more impoverishing aspects of that mechanism.
Pope Francis sort of champions the care of the poor, critiqued making money for the sake of making money. And I guess that is shaped by him being a Jesuit. Could you explain a little bit about the distinction between the Jesuit sort of side of Catholicism and how that shaped him?
So go back to something I said when I was talking about my own life. Jesuit identity starts with an experience of God, not what you might call abstract belief in God or a good experience of going to Mass or wanting to belong to a community. Those things are all good, and Jesuits can enjoy them as much as anybody else. But I guess for the hard core of our identity as Jesuits is to be people steeped in an experience of God. That's not that unusual in what we call the religious orders, people like the Benedictines and the Carmelites and various other religious orders one could mention, Franciscans. We're part of that tradition. So above all, you can distinguish what we call the religious clergy, in other words, those who are members of religious orders, from what we call the secular clergy, typical parish priests who work for the local bishop. That's a big distinction. The two sides have been in rivalry and conflictual relations for well over 1,000 years, nearly 2,000 years, since the first Desert Fathers decided that having an officially Christian empire was far too comfortable. They were out into the desert to live an austere life and to sort of seek God out there. Ever since then, there's been tension between the kind of institutional, liturgical, official expression of the church, and then these other people who want to live a radical kind of closeness to God, and who usually end up taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, either living in monasteries like the Benedictines or friaries in the middle of cities like the Dominicans and the Franciscans. And then in the 16th century, you get this new expression of that tradition, a society of priests whose life is dedicated to the preaching of the word, to the education of people, and to the cultivation of an experience of God and closeness to the poor. And that's called the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. It was a bit of a revolution in religious life, all sorts of ways. It didn't quite fit the old profile of the monks and the friars. So it's always been a bit controversial. But the first generation of Jesuits were absolutely extraordinary in that they suddenly found themselves in all parts of the globe. I mean, think of the 16th century, early 17th century, a great age of discovery journey. I think all Jesuits look back at that age and think, my goodness, what an extraordinary period of experience. And it was very creative. And those Jesuits were not scared to try experiments. The most famous kind of experiment we tried is now what we call enculturation. And it meant really entering deeply into the culture of the people whom you were seeking to evangelize. So it wasn't a superficial, we speak to you in Italian or Spanish and hope we learn your language. But that's not enough. We also learn your culture. So we don't just want to know what the words mean, but what they mean within the actual context in which they're said. And then, of course, beyond that, we're preaching a religious message. So tell us about the religious vision of your culture. So you have some, extraordinary, especially Italian missionaries. Roberto di Nobili, who goes to India and basically enters the high Brahmin culture of Indian society in order to assimilate that culture and that religious experience for himself, specifically so that he can then speak the gospel of Jesus Christ into it. It's dangerous, isn't it, to do that? Really enter the reality of another culture, another reality. You can get lost in it. It has a profoundly transformative experience on you. It's not just a matter of going in and delivering something. It's a matter of being remade. So it was complicated. And it had its critics in the Catholic Church who said, this is dangerous. This is accommodating secular pagan cultures, for example. Well, it stood the test of time. And today, the Catholic Church's understanding of how you communicate the gospel is steeped in that vision. Nobody imagines that you can just sort of go into a foreign culture and just give them a series of propositions which they have to assent to, and that's them evangelized. Nobody thinks that now. So there was actually the seeds of a much, much later consensus forged by those people. So you get the seeds of what today we call interreligious dialogue, which has become very much an almost routine part of the life of the church in many countries. Certainly a very important function of any modern pope is to be a kind of convener of the world's religions from time to time. That was an identity really embraced radically by Pope St. John Paul II, the great conservative who kissed a Quran. He wanted a good example of why your bipolar model for understanding the church doesn't work. That's a wonderful example. That's not who Pope John Paul II was. Francis was neither as dramatic as Pope St. John Paul II, nor as reticent about that sort of thing as was his predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI, who was very, very cautious about interreligious dialogue in general. But he threw himself into it, and what he brought to that was the capacity for making friends and inspiring great confidence. One of the things that it has eluded the church was really good relationships with leadership in key Islamic countries. And Francis made strides in that. Now, I don't know what the fruit are going to be or what necessarily what they have been. I'm a bit out of date in these areas now. You'd have to speak to a specialist, maybe someone at the Holy See in Rome. But one of the things Francis was able to achieve was to establish a really good rapport with some key Muslim leaders throughout the world, most notably with the leader of the University Al-Azhar in Cairo, which is the elite university in the Islamic world. And he issued a joint declaration with him, which then inspired a great teaching document, Fratelli Tutti, which was issued during the pandemic, a call to social friendship across the world at a time, as you know, of terrible polarization, online lies, fake news, all the rest of the things we know about so well. That document came out of that experience. And in a way, you can trace it all the way back to the early Jesuits, engaging with culture, engaging with religion, and wanting to have deep encounters with those other human experiences.
At the end of last year, around the time of the US election, I went over to the United States because I am a big politics geek, and I thought it was a good idea to go and visit when it was a very tense time, Atlanta in Georgia. And I went to the church that Martin Luther King preached at. It was a church taken over by his grandfather, who practiced the social gospel, and very much aligned with the sort of things that you're talking about in terms of close to the community, being in the community, helping the community.
Yes.
And he helped make it become one of the wealthiest Black communities in the whole of America. And I suppose Martin Luther King is someone, again, that we oversimplify in who he was and his life and his mission, and complex man, and had there's a lot going on in his life. And I just assumed he was a maverick figure, and people like that just appear in the world, and that's who they are. But then I didn't realize that his grandfather was doing that, that he was leading boycotts of newspapers and leading the community, and his father was as well. And so I suppose it speaks to that thing of what the history books tell us, and then actually going to that community and visiting, that part of Atlanta, and to have a park ranger give an hour talk in the church that he preached in and his family preached in. I learned probably more about African-American history in that hour talk than I'd ever learned in any documentary or anything like that,
That's interesting, isn't it? We are so immersed in an individualistic vision in so many ways. And the assumption that, great leaders, inspirational individuals kind of come out of nowhere. Whereas usually they have actually been nourished by things called traditions. They've been formed by communities, often of faith, but not necessarily of faith. Ritual may have played a part in their lives, study of sacred texts. These are often what actually shape people. Even the great founders of the Enlightenment, we tend to think of as the fathers of secularism. They're often operating out of a religious vision, which is inculcated in them. And I think it's one of the crises we face today. I mean, have we got a crisis of leadership in the modern world? Yeah, I think we'd have to agree that that's going on, even if we might disagree about exactly its manifestations. But we've got a major crisis of leadership in the world. I think it's probably got something to do with the breakdown of these nourishing communities that form people.
Attention is turning to the election of a successor. And could you explain conclave, the conclave? And
Yes.
what's that?
Well, it is not rocket science. So the world's cardinals gather in Rome. In fact, they've already done so. Do we know what a cardinal is? So,
Do you want to explain? Do you want to?
by all means, if we need to do that, that's no problem. The original idea was that these were the parish priests of the Diocese of Rome. The Pope's main title, the original title, is the Bishop of Rome. Rome is his city. Rome is the capital city of the Roman Empire. I think we know that. And it had a large number of churches over which he had authority and jurisdiction. And in each of those, there would be a priest, just as you find parish priest in a parish within a diocese. Because this was the mother church of the Roman Catholic Church, it became the custom that a leader, an important archbishop from another part of Europe, would become a cardinal, be given this honorific title associated with the church in Rome, and brought in some sense, as to be in a kind of closer governing relationship with the Pope, a kind of supporter. Obviously, at different periods of time, that took a different shape. So you get some rather unedifying examples of very young cardinals who happen to be related to the Pope, let's say. Not such a good development. Fortunately, that era is behind us. But generally, the cardinals would be high-ranking clerics in their own parts of the world, England, France, Spain, Italy, wherever the church was, who would be brought in. And the main job of the College of Cardinals was to gather at the death of the Pope to elect his successor. Now, how many candidates are there for the papacy? Currently about 600 million. Why is that? Because all you have to be is male and Catholic. I haven't got the figures on me, but we say 1.2 billion Catholics notionally. So there must be a very large number of actual candidates. Nobody imagines it will be anybody but one of the cardinals in the conclave. But just to be clear, it could be any male Catholic. That's a rather odd part of the whole story, but maybe worth mentioning. The conclave itself is a fairly ancient tradition. I'm not a historian and I don't do dates, so I'm not even going to go there. People have access to something called Wikipedia for that sort of thing. But the idea is quite simply that the cardinals are locked away in the Sistine Chapel, where they spend time voting, presumably talking to each other. I'm not privy to those meetings, so I don't exactly know how it pans out. But I imagine it's mainly informal conversations, people trying to work out a consensus and forge agreements and agree a vision. They do a number of ballots every day. During a normal conclave day, there are 2 in the morning, I think, and 2 in the afternoon. Each ballot takes quite a long time because, as well as writing the name down on an official ballot slip, each one has to go up in turn to say a prayer, to put the ballot in the box, and then they're counted very slowly and very carefully, very solemnly. So I suspect a ballot would take over an hour, I guess, between voting and counting and having a result. If the conclave doesn't come up with a 2/3 majority, which is what's required for the election of a pope, then they burn all the ballot papers in a special stove with straw in it, I think, and the smoke comes out black, and everybody else can see the smoke coming out from their vantage point in St. Peter's Square, and they know that there is no election. But as soon as there is a majority, then some chemicals, I believe, are put in the fire so that it comes out white, and then the bells of St. Peter start ringing, and then various things start to kick into gear, and the Vatican curial machine starts to do its job. People start arriving in St. Peter's Square. BBC and all the news networks sort of start to say, news alert, we're going to have an announcement. And I think roughly half an hour after that, by the time the new Pope has donned his white soutane and maybe said a few words to his cardinals, possibly phoned his mother, though she probably isn't alive anymore. The things you might do in such a situation, then he goes out onto the balcony in St. Peter's Square and is acclaimed as Pope. And the conclave means with a key, and that's simply to say they've got to be locked away, and that's for a very good reason. That was to keep them from being influenced by external forces, and that's as important now as it ever has been. They're more likely to be influenced by reading blogs, I suspect, than having the Empress of Russia phoning up to say, how dare you even contemplate choosing that man where it's got to be that man. So there's always been a real interest in who's the Pope. This was of geopolitical significance in Europe and now more widely in the world. And I'm sure there are countries which you could imagine which would be very keen either not to have what they would perceive as a liberal Pope or a conservative Pope, and they'd like very much to exert a bit of influence through this or that cardinal. So very important that they're cut off from the world. That's what that's all about.
I don't know if you want to I mean, you've said that there's, over 600 million people that were eligible to become Pope. I don't know if you want to talk about it to any of the candidates, or whether you'd want to pass on that and leave that to pundits. Or
Well, it's above my pay grade. First instance, not a cardinal, nor ever likely to be one. The great thing I think about the Vatican is it is a centre of communications. They really do have a phenomenal way of picking up what's going on all over the world. And I don't know about you, Tom, but I sense that I know a little bit about the patch I live in. And actually, these days, I'm more and more skeptical about what I think I know, because we live in this extraordinarily epistemologically challenged reality where it's very hard really to know whether one is being taken for a ride or manipulated. And I always find myself withdrawing from thinking I even understand my own country sometimes. What's going on in Rome is you have people coming from micro states in the Pacific Ocean, from all the great countries of the world, from countries where Catholicism isn't very well represented, but nevertheless, a place like Algeria, for example. I think Burma, am I right? There's a cardinal from Burma. So these are not great Catholic countries, but those people are going to bring really live, raw, interesting experience to that discussion. And if the Conclave does its job, and I think we must hope and pray that it does, frankly, it's not terribly interested in the latest political machinations in Washington, D.C., let alone London. They really care less about those things. So all the things we get exercised about, and which therefore the pundits are paid to pander to, they should be sublimely irrelevant, because I hope what they're dealing with is a much richer, multi-layered, real picture of reality as we face it. I'm very jealous that I'm not there to hear some of it, but that would be that's the treasure, it seems, of the Conclave, and that's pretty rare these days.
Yeah, connection with something, well, A, a very ancient tradition, and B, someone that, as you say, has big sway in the world. Even if you're not Catholic, people still listen to what the Pope says, and their actions and everything can say a lot.
Yeah.
And a lot of people can move with them. Again, related to sort of the popular culture, have you seen Conclave?
Of course.
Yeah.
Great fun. Enjoyed it very much. A big Rick Fiennes fan, and I enjoyed it very much. And
And
I have to say, as these things go, you don't really expect Hollywood to represent your religion very well. We all know that when the media or when films show our bit of the world, it's usually not very accurate, though we trust it totally when we see it doing everybody else's. Actually, it was pretty good. It was pretty accurate from my sense. Things aren't quite as balletic, quite as photogenic as certain scenes in that film, but otherwise I thought it was not by any means, wasn't a caricature of things. So like Cardinal so-and-so is obviously being, he's being built up into this rather laughable figure, or not very likable figure at the very least.
And finally, to sort of draw it back to Pope Francis, his legacy, what do you think that is for the Catholic Church, but also for the wider world, and his mark that he's left in the papacy and his life, I suppose? I
mean, by definition, I'm the slipperiest person to interview on time. Sorry about that. By definition, it's quite difficult to know just a few days after he's died. I mean, the legacy is, I assume you're saying, what's going to be the long-lasting effect of this? And I know what I hope it is. I know what I probably think it is. But again, I'm quite cautious about my own claims to insight. I think he's had a profound effect on the Vatican machine. So in the old days, this is what bishops said, and so I think one can trust this as a real truth about the situation. Bishops would tell you that they go on their regular ad limina visits, as they're called. Bishops from different parts of the world, they all go together to Rome for a couple of weeks, and they meet the Pope and they meet all the officials. In the old days, it was fairly typical that they would be rapped over the knuckles and told what they were doing wrong, and they would sometimes feel like a group of naughty schoolboys sort of being taken around head teacher's study. And it was that kind of experience. And I've heard that so often, I don't think that's just a laughable caricature. Pope Francis was absolutely clear right from the start. He was very rough with his curia and received a lot of criticism from people for this. He said to the curia, you are the servant of the mission of the people out there in the field. So when the bishops come on their ad limina visit, you're not to tell them off. It's not about how they work for the curia bureaucracy. It's how can we be of service to you? So you tell us about what challenges you're facing and how we can be there to support you. Now, That's not an easy transformation to bring out in any organization, because it goes to the very heart of the culture. You can write documents and policies, but to change the way people actually think, feel, and behave is a big job. I don't know how he did it, and I'm sure it hasn't been done perfectly, but people say that it's a very different experience. I think that's a profoundly important change, because it makes the bishops more responsible. It means they can be a little bit more adult and feel that they don't have to constantly be looking over their shoulder, so they can take a leadership responsibility in a way they possibly felt they couldn't before. And they feel supported from the center, which is exactly how it should be. One of the titles of the Pope is the servant of the servants of God. Pope Francis took that very seriously. He saw himself at the bottom of the hierarchy. I'm not there to lord it over you. I'm there to serve you so that you can serve the people. It's a kind of inverted pyramid. That's what he said several times. Of course, that's not original. He gets that from Jesus Christ himself. But that was really important. A lot of people don't write that in brackets, work out why that might be by contemplating human psychology. It was one example. The synod, famously, he goes to his death with the word synod almost inscribed on his heart. This idea that it is not just the people at the top who teach in a kind of monologue to the people at the bottom who just receive and listen and are obedient, that actually we have to talk to each other about what we are experiencing, about the experience of faith, about the experience of living faith in this particular context. Well, you can see again that you were asking earlier, where does he get this? How does this Jesuit ethos cash out in his life? And this is one of the ways that it's just, we are people who are interested in the experience of God, and we have to talk about that with each other and to our spiritual directors and to our superiors. And this is perfectly normal. And therefore, for us, it's a bit odd just to sort of talk to people as though somehow they are totally passive recipients of our wisdom and learning. So the synod reflects the idea that we are people who have to speak to each other. And that when we do, we learn from each other. And we find ourselves encouraged and challenged and transformed by the process. This isn't some great revolutionary insight, but it's a little bit of a change in the way that the Catholic Church traditionally operates. Many areas of the Christian churches do operate a bit more like this. And the Catholic Church has a particularly sort of authoritarian type of history. And Francis's great challenge was to say, well, we need to unlearn some of the sort of exclusively top-down way of growing and discerning the way forward. We don't know whether that's going to be sort of followed up. It's a vastly ambitious program of reform, which he leaves half done necessarily, because it's the work of decades, really. It's again the transformation of a culture in the church. It has its great supporters, especially among religious orders, for example. It also has its great enemies who say, this is a total waste of time. The church is there to teach the eternal truths of the gospel. We don't need to ask people's opinions. And then you get some who, particularly coming from the English-speaking world, who say synods are for people like Anglicans. It's a talking shop. It will lead to change in teaching or watering down of the gospel. I think that's a needless fear, but I understand where it's coming from. But as I say, I don't think it should stop the program. One of the decisions that the successor of Pope Francis will have to make is, what does he do with all of that? You can either grab it enthusiastically and saying, this is where we're going, continuity with Francis on this, and synodality, here we come. Or he could do the opposite and say openly, that's not where his interest is, the situation has changed, we're in a new world of this, that, and the other, or somewhere in between. But that's something maybe to watch out for, and that will be significant. Whatever his successor does, though, there is now going to be this moment, these 5 or 6 years in the life of the church, which is a short period, but nevertheless an important one, when that vision of the church was on the table. And that's not lost. It doesn't go away. The documents are still there. The memories are still there for the time being. And the way the church works, it's not unusual for us to say, well, we'll do this, and then a bit of a retreat, regrouping, checking stuff out, refocusing. A new generation comes along and says, you know what, that looks actually pretty promising. Why don't we? And you see it all the time, people being inspired by people who were dealing with problems 100 years ago. I'm afraid that's the timescale the church works in. That's just one of those things. You've got to be patient. You can't afford to be in a hurry to see the great reforms you may dream of to change. So the legacy will definitely be there. but don't ask me where it's going and what the timeline is. So those are two examples. One could talk about many, many other things, but most of the other things were already sort of in process in his predecessors. I mean, people talk about Laudato Si's great encyclical on integral ecology, as we call it in the Catholic world. Catholic environmentalism, not a very happy way of putting it, but let's say that just to make it clear what we're talking about. The ground had already been prepared by Pope St. John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI. He certainly consolidated it and added his own, I think, quite powerful experience in Latin America of environmental degradation and the effect that had on the poor. It's a very, very rich document, but it's a document, nevertheless, that it was already anticipated by previous popes. Those who like to say, well, sort of woke green pope, let's hope that all dies its death. Most unlikely. That problem is really with us, isn't it, for centuries now. I think people will look back on Francis and see an important staging post in the line of the Church's response to that, but not the only one. It certainly wasn't his idea. And it's a very odd comment on, Western culture that stewardship and care for creation, for our institutions, for our countryside is identified as a left-wing project because isn't it the most conservative thing you could think about? And in some cultures, notably in France, you do get this sort of tradition of conservative ecology. That's real. I mean, Francis is very conservative in his vision, quite anti-technocratic. In some ways, much more suspicious of the project of modernity than an awful lot of Catholic commentators in the United States, for example, who were very wedded to a neoliberal economic project, which Francis really didn't like. And there's the Latin American in him.
Yeah.
Latin Americans never came to terms with that. And their judgment seems now to be the consensus in the world. It's fed up with neoliberalism now. He points us towards the contingency of some of our slightly weird ideological options. Maybe call it a day, and thanks very much, Tom, for such thoughtful questions, and I've enjoyed it very much.
Tom, that was a very insightful conversation with Father Howard.
It really demonstrates that a leader isn't born, but they're made. And it's also quite interesting to understand that his choice of decision-making and what he represents cannot be boxed into one particular ideology. I think it's far more nuanced than what it's presented as. That is something which is good to know. But I think a lot of the decisions, personally, a lot of the decisions that were taken by him were progressive and for the benefit of making the church a little more inclusive, I suppose.
I suppose in the conversation, Father Howard made the point that often, we project our political views, our thoughts, our hopes onto people like the Pope. And in the discussion, we talked about people like Nelson Mandela and, Martin Luther King. In the world in which we live in a very fast-paced world, and that's why we wanted to create this podcast, because we wanted to slow things down, have a bit of conversation, and the nuance and the complication can be lost. So, Pope Francis, by his own admission, as sort of Father Howard says, when he was sort of running things in Argentina, he was quite authoritarian in many ways in how he ran things. And he sort of learned from that. It was a very painful time. And he was almost liberated when he was invited by John Paul II to Rome to work as a bishop and to progress through the hierarchy in the Vatican. And so I think also Pope Francis's views on the environment are actually in keeping with Catholic teaching of stewardship. So in actual fact, it could be argued that the care of the environment isn't just a liberal thing. It can be conservative too, because there is the conservative heritage of looking after the world and care for the world. So I suppose it's a bit of a lesson there in saying, well, this guy was progressive, but he was more than that. He didn't necessarily sit with a political view in the traditional way that we would think it. I'm really grateful again for Father Howard for offering his time. A very generous guest, and we really do appreciate it.
And that brings this episode to a close. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating or a comment wherever you're listening now. This has been a Be the Change Media Network production. I'm Lily Mott.
I'm Tom Spare.
And I'm Sid Kurapati. Thanks for listening to the Political Dispatch.